Hello, everyone. Welcome to Class 3 of our 6-week online course, New England Research. My name is Ginevra Morse. I'm the Director of Education and Online Programs at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. Once again, I will be moderating this class and each class over the next few weeks. So tonight we'll continue our family history trek through the New England states, tonight with a focus on New Hampshire. And your instructor for this session is Chief Genealogist David Allen Lambert. David has been on the staff of NEHGS since 1993 and is an internationally recognized speaker on the topics of genealogy and history. He's published many articles in the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, the New Hampshire Genealogical Record, Rhode Island Roots, the Mayflower Descendant, and American Ancestors magazine. He's also the author of A Guide to Massachusetts Cemeteries and is the tribal genealogist for the Massachusetts Ponkapog Indians of Massachusetts. His genealogical expertise includes New England and Atlantic Canadian records of the 17th through 21st century, military records, DNA research, and Native American and African American genealogical research in New England. So David will begin by presenting a very brief overview of the history and settlement of New Hampshire, followed by some go-to published guides and resources. Much of the class will focus on the records that exist for the state, how to find them, and how to make the most of these resources in your family history research. And we'll end with a look at some of the various repositories across the state as well. You'll find a PDF of today's slides at the online course page, as well as a handout. And starting tomorrow, you'll be able to watch a recording of this presentation on that course page. Also, before moving on, I do want to note that we are, of course, still broadcasting from our homes to your home with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we thank you for your patience and for bearing with us. If we do lose the connection for any reason on our end, we will still have you will still have access to a full recording on that webpage. And a reminder to please remain muted throughout the presentation. You will be able to ask questions by typing them into the chat panel, and David will answer as many questions as he can during 3 Q&A sessions. All right, so without further ado, I'm honored to turn things over to David.
Thank you, Ginevra, and hello, everyone. Once again, I was honored to teach you the Massachusetts chapter 1. Now we're on to chapter 3, New Hampshire, or better known as the Granite State, but you may also know it as the White Mountain State. So New Hampshire's got a very rich history that goes back into the 17th century, whereas a lot of people think of Massachusetts being the sole place for 17th century history. In fact, the earliest settlement at Odian's Point, now Rye, New Hampshire, dates back to 1623. And that's just 3 years after the start of the Great Migration with the Pilgrims landing in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Now, settling on further on into the history, the first 4 places that are the towns that we're settling is Portsmouth, Dover, Exeter, New Hampshire, and Hampton, New Hampshire. And these are the earliest settled towns in the early part of the 17th century. And Massachusetts actually has a pinnacle part of sort of a tug of war of a little part of southern New Hampshire when there was Old Norfolk County. So Massachusetts annexed New Hampshire as Old Norfolk County in 1643, and this stays on through 1679, 1680. So there are separate probates, separate deeds. You'll find that Family Search has these online. You'll also find some of the town records will confuse you. And the main thing that really confuses people is that in Massachusetts, where there was Old Norfolk County, well, it was called Norfolk County then because there was no older Norfolk County. The current county of Norfolk was started in 1793. So until 1792, there was Norfolk County, but then they called it Old Norfolk after the incorporation of New Norfolk County from Suffolk County. Hope you remember that from the Massachusetts class. Well, just a quick review. In 1718, the Scotch-Irish are settling in New Hampshire, and places you'll get such towns as Londonderry, for obviously towns that have a sounding of a Northern Irish village. You probably will see that Derry and Londonderry are two that may come right off the top of your head. You may have ancestors that were from a Scottish heritage, settled in Ireland, and then ultimately settled in the 17 teens and 1720s in New Hampshire. You'll also find that a lot of the settlement of the Connecticut River Valley part of New Hampshire is taking place in the 1730s and 1740s, just shy of when we're entering in the French and Indian War. Now, the migration and population, I mean, obviously we're starting coastal, just like we did for Massachusetts. You're going to get into a settlement where you can get in, clear the land. And of course, New Hampshire is still very forested. Unlike some parts of Massachusetts, you have to go to the Berkshires. New Hampshire has some wonderful woodlands still there. So the settlement of the original four towns, as I'd mentioned, the towns of Portsmouth, Dover, Exeter, and Hampton occur in the 1630s. So does settlement of the Isle of Shoals. Now, a lot of the migration takes place northward, right out of Massachusetts. My own ancestor, Edward Gilman, who was actually also the ancestor of the President Abraham Lincoln, has a New Hampshire connection indirectly because of the Gilman family. We settled in Exeter, New Hampshire in the 1630s, and there's still Gilmans up there now, and my whole side of my family would stay in New Hampshire till the time of the Industrial Revolution and then come back into Massachusetts. So they've gone kind of full circle. The Ulster Scots, as we say, settled in 1718, and you'll still find families with Scottish sounding or Scottish surnames in the regions where they settled, and of course throughout northern New England. And generally speaking, they have now been up there for over 300 years. So you may have some of your ancestors having been some of the first settlers of, say, not particularly just England. The Connecticut River Valley was heavily settled by the great-grandchildren of those earlier settlers, and of course new immigrants are arriving into the 18th century as well. You get a lot of population push into Portsmouth, where being a port city, and people are just moving onward from there. And again, it's the idea of primogeniture. You're dealing with a farm that may have been 100 acres, and well, maybe the oldest son and second oldest son might divide it, but if you're the ninth child, you're probably going to need to move somewhere else with your new bride and your family. So moving into the Connecticut River Valley is sometimes the likely migration. The settlement of the interior, as it is cleared, I mean, you're still contending with bears and wolves, and not the sure facing of French-Canadian, well, not Canadian at the point, but the French that were coming down into raiding parties of the Native Americans in the 18th century. So you have that fear, and a lot of times, again, it's just a garrison house, and they start building up around there. My ancestor, John Pittman, who lived to the ripe old age of 102, dying in 1834, when he settled in Barnstead, New Hampshire, he said that he had to constantly contend with the wolves and the bears. I'm glad that Barnstead doesn't have that so much every day now. The exodus out of Maine into the eastern townships and west also occurs. So where you have Maine also being coastal, a little northeasterly of where New Hampshire and Massachusetts connects on the Essex County border, you find a lot of people are moving out of Maine and into the area of New Hampshire. Now, keeping that in mind, Maine at that point in time, as you probably remember the class with Melanie McComb last week, was part of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts until 1820. Now, and again, 19th century immigrant groups are going to settle throughout New England, and this is even more so when you have the push of the Industrial Revolution. Factories in places like Manchester, New Hampshire are leading the Industrial Revolution in New England, and New Hampshire is no stranger to now having settlement in from places all over the globe. Now, the first settlers in New Hampshire, of course, are the native families of the Native American tribes of New Hampshire. Now, the Western Abenaki lived along the Connecticut River Valley in New Hampshire, Vermont, and as well as Massachusetts, getting down into northwestern Massachusetts, as you can see in this map here. The Eastern Abenaki tribe populated parts of Maine and New Brunswick. And then what you get on a lot of these larger tribes are the sub-tribes that are located within it. The Mississauga, right on the Quebec border into Vermont. And you have some of the tribes are, of course, later on intermarrying as their lands are taken away and there's travel and migration within the tribes themselves. And there are many descendants of these early New Hampshire native people still amongst the families of New Hampshire today. So one of the things we want to start off with is talk a little bit about state guides and resources that are available to you. And some of these are going to be a little repetitive, but you may have some of these books on your own bookshelf. Charles Henry Pope did a wonderful tome on pioneers of Maine and New Hampshire, and this covers the early settlers between 1623 and 1660. This is a publication republished by NEHGS, and as well as the Genealogical Dictionary of Maine and New Hampshire by Noyce, Libby, and Davis. That is really the genealogical go-to for the earliest families for New Hampshire, with all of the great lists and dates in that collection are right there. So you can find the earliest arrival. You can often find some very good resources that Walter Goodwin Davis, for instance, was one of the premier genealogists for New Hampshire, and he has collected some of the finest research to even to this day we still find as a good resource. Another wonderful volume that don't judge it always by its age is the Genealogical Dictionary of the First Settlers of New England. And this is actually a book that was put together by James Savage over 160 years ago. So this was published in 1860, compiled in the 1850s, but still does give you some valuable clues, keeping in mind that, of course, there's been a lot of scholarship since then. So you do want to look for more recent scholarship to complement the original 19th century works, but still very valuable to use. The population growth in the movement, L.K. Matthews' book, The Expansion of New England, really does give you the understanding of why and where you find the population of the masses leaving and arriving through different parts of New England. And this is really a good tome to look at, and it covers, the settlement and spread out of New England right out to the Mississippi River, right until the time of the end of the Civil War. So, and again, another reprint from NEHGS. We have definitely looked at some of the better tomes that have been put in the field and reprinted them, so you don't have to scour antiquarian bookshops to find an original copy. And of course, the 5th edition by Michael LeClaire, the Genealogist Handbook of New England Research, is another valuable tome. Stay tuned for Rhonda McClure's 6th edition, which will be out very shortly. Diane Rappaport has done a really wonderful book. This one is not currently in print that I know of. I find it occasionally at genealogy conferences being sold because it has never been reprinted since this edition. But what this does, and I explained this a little bit in the Massachusetts section, is it explains what New England court records are available. All the New Hampshire courts are explained, the history of the court system, which is very valuable to understand what courts you would need to look at when you're dealing with 17th right on through the 20th century court record research in the state of New Hampshire. And it also references all the FHL microfilms. Now, of course, when Diane did this book, there was not a lot of things being put online on Family Search at that point in time. So you don't have URLs, but you can take those Family History Library microfilm numbers and translate them in the Family History Library catalog with the film number and find out if it's actually digitally online. The New Hampshire State Papers are, as a historian and a genealogist, is something I turn to a lot. I think as a genealogist, you have to understand the town history. In getting to the primary resources that the establishments of the towns, the way they were governed and set up, the New Hampshire State Papers really complement that. So you're going to get in there, besides the Revolutionary War rolls, these are, of course, the original transcribed rolls of all the all of the New Hampshire soldiers in the Revolutionary War. So you can use that in your DAR and SAR applications. It has the town charters for each one of the 18th century and 17th century settled communities. It gives you probate records from 1735 to 1771. And it also gives you various court records and court papers throughout the 17th century. And on your syllabus, you'll find the different various URLs that you need to go to. There it is right there at the state of New Hampshire, sos.newhampshire.gov papers.aspx. And that will give you an online version, and you can actually download each one of the volumes as PDFs. And there is an index as well. All right, let's turn to vital records. In New Hampshire is a little bit more complex than Massachusetts because not every community is published and indexed like we have the official series for Massachusetts. It's spotty coverage for the published histories. But now that we're living in a digital age, a lot of these can be easily accessed by using online websites such as Family Search, Ancestry, etc. So the New Hampshire Vital Records at NEHGS, we have cover 1654 to 1969, and they're also online, which really makes it nice. There are some other great sources that you want to check into, and that would include newspapers that have transcribed various vital records over the course of their publication. And we have a collection at NEHGS for the New Hampshire Gazette from 1756 to 1800. And online family history library website is going to have many of these early 17th and 18th century microfilms available digitally now, so you can search them at home. So you can look at the statewide compilations, such as the 1654 to 1969, but you can also then drill into the original town record itself. They also have available at NEHGS on microfilm and also Family History Library. Online is the divorce records to 1938 for New Hampshire. Now, one of the things that we still have at NEHGS is microfilm. And I think that complements sometimes when the Wi-Fi is down. So you can, when you're visiting American Ancestors, NEHGS in Boston, know that you can look at either two mediums, either the microfilm or the online resource itself. And the interesting thing about New Hampshire is you have to learn a new alphabet. They're alphabetized by the first and third letter of the surname. I've taken an image of some of the boxes of microfilm, and if you can kind of see here the way it's arranged. So 52, 53, 54, and 55, it goes from Kimball to Knowles, Knowles to Lacasse, Lacasse to Loisel, Loisel to Langley. Now, just looking at 55, why would you find Langley like after Loisel? It's because the first and third letter of the name. So L-I and L-N. The previous one L-C to L-I, etc. So it's a little confusing at first, but now that they're online, but when you are to use the microfilm, keep that in mind. The other thing is to know that they come from a variety of different records. There's not one set collection of records in New Hampshire. That statewide vital records didn't really get underway with a great compilation until 1900. So before that, there's any rhyme or reason where records are coming from. They're coming from the gravestone records, they're coming from church records, they're coming from probate records, whatever the town clerk could get their hands on to abstract vital records, they would use that. And also keep in mind, in this collection, not every town is included. This is exactly why looking at the New Hampshire Guide on the New England Handbook is valuable to let you know if it's included in that series. Now, just to give you an example, so if you look at this record here, this is a record of birth in 1823 for a Joseph Grant in Dunstable, New Hampshire. Now, it doesn't give a lot of information. It does tell us that his father's name is Justice, his mother's name is Hannah, and at the bottom it tells you the town clerk who's recording it. I want you to kind of look at the image on the right here and see that October 7th, 1905, that's not the child's date of death. That's when they actually got around to being recorded. Now, this could be from a variety of different reasons. One, the town clerk is starting to gather this information, and they may be turning to old family Bibles, church records. They could also be finding a late registration. So this child could be now 80 2 years old and say, I finally want to get my birth record recorded. And they brought forward the old family Bible. So do note when the record was recorded, because obviously this wasn't originally recorded in 1823. The other thing is that you're going to find a variety of details on the records, and it's going to change from town clerk to town clerk, and not just town by town. So you have here a Dr. Jonathan Dearborn and Clemenia Philbrick of Seabrook, New Hampshire, that he is a physician. They're both white. They're married by David Harriman, and they're married in 1839. On the right-hand side, you see all this extra information. And wouldn't it be wonderful to know the bride's and the groom's mother and father, their race, their age, their occupation, their birthplace? It would be amazing to find that for marriage that early. The problem is that they're using a modern form. So when they were writing the older records up, they are using a form that was more applicable to the information being recorded, say, after 1900. Now, but some of the clerks did record earlier records that had this much information. I'll show you an example in the next image. So in this case, this is a marriage just occurring about 26 years later, and this is in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. And in this case, we have Stephen Dearborn and Emma Prescott of Gilmanton, New Hampshire, giving the exact age of the bride and groom, giving their race, giving that he's a merchant, and that he was born in Salisbury, New Hampshire, and that she was born in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. So obviously they're going, at that point in time, they're both in Gilmanton, but the groom is originally from Salisbury. Who married them, that he was a clergyman, and that not a justice of the peace. So you may look for church records in Gilmanton. This is a clue where you want to start looking at town histories and understanding who the clergy are. Many early 19th and early 20th century town histories for New Hampshire are available online. Or if you really want to just be snazzy with your research, you can just put in, quote, Reverend Joseph Blake, close quote, Gilmanton. See what you get. In this case, you probably will find out that he is on a page on a document or a page from a book on archive.org that states that he is maybe a Methodist minister, a Baptist minister, etc. Now, remember that form from before. You're not getting the additional information. So in this case, we're getting the parents of Stephen. We have his father is Stephen Dearborn. His father's a merchant. And we're not getting an age. We're getting mother is M.A. Dearborn. Now, maybe they're of the same family, or maybe they just did not know her maiden name. Then we go down to Alfred Prescott, printer of Gilmanton, and his wife Octavia Prescott. Again, they're either both of the same surname, or someone had Alfred and Octavia Prescott and Stephen and M.A. Dearborn when they copied it over. You need to do a little further information, and maybe it's looking for the original record in the Gilmanton town records, or looking for the church record. Never take the transcribed copy from later period with 100% accuracy, because something could have copied across wrong. So do a little extra homework on that one. All right, here's a post-1900 marriage, and this is from an intention of marriage filed on October 30th, 1912, and they were married on the 11th of November, 1912 in Manchester, New Hampshire. You get the bride and the groom. You get that they're both from Austria, that it's his second marriage, her first marriage. He is widowed. Then on the right-hand side, it's giving you the name of the bride and groom's parents. What's the interesting thing? It gives you their age at the time of when their kids were getting married. In New Hampshire, this is really unique that you're catching this information. You won't find this, for instance, in Massachusetts records. You'll get the name of the parents, but you're not going to get their age. It's telling you the father is a farmer, born in Austria, and goes into the age of the mother. It goes into the age of the bride's father is 89, and her mother is 65. In both cases, there's a little bit of difference in age, but it does give you both maiden names. So with this case, looking at records in Austria, you may be able to find Frank and Anna's birth now that you can also search for the parents' marriage if you can determine where. Of course, that would be naturalization records to try to see where in Austria they're from, but this is 20th century, making it very possible. The other thing that they have, which is very, very valuable, and this is a family history library microfilm as well, we have these on film at NEHS, is the brides index. Because if you look at the early marriages in New Hampshire, they're male-centric. They're listed by the groom's last name. So if you're a guild of one name study person and you want to find all the Whitneys that got married in New Hampshire, and you just don't care about the men, you want to see the girls too, looking at the New Hampshire Brides Index will then give you the name of the bride who she married. And then what you would do is then go back like you did before, look for the original marriage under the groom's name, and then find the actual record. It's a little abbreviated here. You don't get as much information. As you can see, there's marriages from 1799 on this sheet, as well as marriages from 1876, etc. So it's combining all of them prior to 1900. I think it's very useful. Now, a death record post-1900, of course, looks a little bit more like a modern death record that you would still find today, including the point of getting the birthplace of the person as well as the birthplace of parents. You're getting their occupation, you're getting their address, so then you can Google search and figure out where they were living and where they died, perhaps. You're getting the name of the cemetery on the top of the column on the right. So you get their date of burial, so you know where they're buried. You find the funeral director. You're finding the health history the person is dying from, the duration of the actual condition itself, and the doctor signing off on this. A real wealth of information right here. And you could pull together things as far back as knowing that this person had died, but we now know that they worked in their profession for 20 years. They stopped working in 1933 and died in 1938. So you can almost picture and put together a timeline, if you will, from just key facts that you're finding in there. It gives you how long they were residing at their place of death, etc. You can really dissect this and almost do a little small biographical sketch on each death record when they're this detailed. The other thing that, again, what differs New Hampshire from, say, Massachusetts, and even Maine for that matter, are there not a lot of published vital record books, but the ones that are not always sometimes from the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century. Some of them are actually from modern town reports, as we talked about in Massachusetts chapter. And of course, you probably got this with Melanie on Maine too, is that the annual town reports record vital records well into the 20th century. Well, the smaller the town, the longer they recorded them. So in this book published by Heritage Books by Richard Roberts, you can find vital records of Effingham and Freedom, New Hampshire from 1888 to 2001. That's even later than most of the records that you could actually look at the Vital Record Office. So in this case, a published history may be something you want to have on your shelf. In this case, they're giving you 21st century records.
All right, well, thanks, David. So let's pause here and see if you have any questions. Go ahead and type your question into the chat panel. Let's see. So I know Sarah had one question. I think there was a slide that had the provincial and state papers with the probate going from I think it was 1735 to 1771. The handout says 1635 to 1771. It should be 1635. So you have a much wider span of probate records available to you through that resource. So it's 1635 to 1771 where you can access those probate records. And Catherine asks, so that recording that we saw on the vital record, she says, isn't that recording date on the VR cards the date that it was copied to the cards themselves?
These are the copies that were sent to the state. So from my understanding from the state archives, those are the dates that they were written down and sent to the state itself. Now, if it was copied into the town records, what you would need to look at is the actual town copy, because remember, this is the form that's sent into the state, and see when it was entered in to the records. That's where you're going to be able to find out if it's someone recording their birth years later, or the town clerk doing a multitude of individual records from, say, an old family Bible that someone brought forward and recorded all the kids. So that's why you have to dig a little bit further into the original records of the town, not just the abstracted cards. And from what I understand, that's the date that they were sending it into the state being recorded. Now, it could be also the same date it was recorded in the town, but they do vary.
All right. And Jerry asks, where do you find that bride's index that you showed?
Sure. Now, the bride's index is something that you're going to be able to find on microfilm at any HGS, and I'm going to pull up right now while we're speaking on Family Search to see if that's actually there. So while we're checking that, I'm going to multitask with another question if you've got one, Ginevra, and I'll just pull back with that answer for you in just a second.
Okay, sure. Let's see. Dana asks, where were illegitimate births recorded? Where would you find those? Would they still be in the vital records? Would there be some other place that you would find illegitimate births?
I mean, illegitimate births in the 19th century are going to be recorded right in the records. They won't be closed off. The ones you're going to start to find being closed are, of course, 20th century records, not so much the 19th and before. You'll also find illegitimates recording in the church records, where you may find even further details about, the sin of fornication being confessed before the congregation and the baptism for the child. And you may even find a bastardy bond that has gone forward to basically care for that child that may have been brought forth before the church. The father could have been called out. So even before DNA tests, your church records might give you a little bit more detail, but you will find them in the records. They didn't put them separate until the 20th century. Going back to our previous question real quick, I did find that they are 17 reels of film. I thought it was just about that many. They were filmed by the Family History Library. The original records are at the New Hampshire State Department of Health. They were filmed back in 1970s. Unfortunately, they are locked. So these are the 17 rolls of film you can find on the Family History Library catalog from Family Search, but they have a key above the camera. And as you folks know, that means it's affiliate access. So when any HGS or an other affiliate library opens up, you will be able to click on them, but you won't be able to do them from home. So that's kind of unfortunately the situation for these records, I'm afraid.
And that was the bride's index?
Correct. The Bride's Index, 17 reels of film, filmed in the 1970s, originals with the New Hampshire Department of Health with the Division of Vital Statistics.
Great. And Charles asks, is there an index or some kind of source that shows the divisions of towns? For example, he asks, for example, when did Meredith split from another town? Where would you find that information?
Well, one of the things that I would use first off is the New Hampshire town records. That collection is going to be useful because when you look at those in the Family Search Catalog, you're going to see the break of the years. If you have the New England Handbook, that will give you the date of the incorporation of the town. And in some cases, I think on the new edition, it'll even go as far as telling you what the original or parent town or towns they come from. And this is something that's a type of reference question we get all the time. So if you have a particular town or towns, always feel free to contact me, and I'm more than happy to fill in the blanks for you.
And I think we also have the town guides for New Hampshire on our website. You might want to check that resource as well, and that's linked from the course webpage. So on the left-hand side, or depending on the size of your screen, it might be at the very bottom, but there should be a link to the New England as well as New York town guides, and they usually talk about incorporation date and I believe parent towns as well. So that's something that you might want to check out, Charles.
Yeah, one of the things, if I could just add to Charles' thing, I always look at just in general, if you're looking at the geographical county map, seeing the towns that are abutting, and this is true what we do with English parish records, looking at when those towns are incorporated, and of course if they're older, that could be just generally answer your question. But there are also places you want to look if you're finding, you want to find the marriage intention, you're not finding it in the town records, or if you want to see where the family may have come from, is just looking at those abutting towns. And I spiral out as far as, like, say, 5 miles, sometimes even 10 miles from some New England towns to locate other members of the family that may have gone off to other places.
And Andrew's asking about records from the area that was Massachusetts and then in New Hampshire after the king changed the boundary line. Where would you find those records, or would those be in both states? So if you have a boundary change between states, where are you likely to find those records?
Well, the first place I would check would be, of course, the Massachusetts State Archives. The Mass Archives collection, bar none, is one of the finest collections of 17th and 18th century petitions and basically all the records that were sent to the governor. So if you have a petition that a boundary is going to be changed or a town is going to be annexed, you may find that if it's under the Dominion of New England, for instance, or under Massachusetts, New Hampshire, of course, at the State Archives in Concord is also going to have records. So you kind of have to check both. It's funny the rhyme or reason to it, because some things that you would think, well, it was originally recorded in Massachusetts, so it should be in Massachusetts, and then some things are not recorded there, but you'll find a record of it in New Hampshire. So keeping both under your radar is probably the best thing to do when you're looking for them.
All right, maybe just two more questions before, or maybe three more questions before moving on. So Albert asks, what is the New Hampshire Town Record Index? I've seen the source mentioned by others. I believe that's the resource that's available on the New Hampshire State Library that outlines, it's an online resource. You can look at each of the towns in New Hampshire, and then it will tell you, um, you know, dates for the town report, if they exist, if there are city directories. David, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'm wondering if, well, I mean, in the next part, we're going to talk a bit more about town records itself and what records you'll find in, like, warnings out, original records that were copied at the early 20th century, town by town. And there is a statewide town record series. We have them on microfilm at NEHS, and they've been invaluable for my research for over 30 years. Again, family search microfilms, so more and more of these are getting digitized. So depending on the time frame, if it's you're dealing with 17th through 19th century records, you're probably dealing with the compiled New Hampshire Town Records collection. If it's after that, it could be what Ginevra was referring to.
All right. And then Andrew also asks, where would you find birth records of mixed race marriages? Would those again be in the vital records or church records, or would you find a listing of those elsewhere?
Oh, they should be included in both. They didn't segregate out the records in any way, shape, or form. So African American, Native American, or any race. If you find that the race is recorded, oftentimes in the earlier records, it may not be called out unless it's, say, African American or Native American, and it may just not be indicated one or the other. So you should find those in the records itself. And more so in the 19th and into the 20th century, obviously.
And then finally, Sarah asks, for those pre-1900 VR cards that you showed, is there a way to figure out where that information was coming from on those cards?
Oh, sure. It's from the town clerk or the city clerk. Marriages, of course, are being recorded from the minister or the justice of the peace, returning to the town or city clerk, usually quarterly, sometimes at the end of the year. Then once the state is requiring the vital records to be returned to Concord, for instance, you would then find that the records sometimes would be bundled up, that they would get all of the older records, put them together. Once registration is required, then it's going to be an annual return to the Secretary of State's office.
Yeah, and I know, I think from last class, looking at the main vital record cards, a lot of them very nicely said, like, the source, that they were from town records, this volume. That was beautiful. But it sounds like for this, you may have to do some more digging to actually find the original, but that they're likely coming from those sources that you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So I'll turn it back over to you, David, and we'll talk about those church records and town records that we've alluded to.
Sure. Now, I mean, church records, I mean, are in a lot of cases sometimes earlier than the town records itself. There may have been a church that was founded, and that the records survive into the 17th century or the early 18th century. So using a combination of both vital records and church records will help you. Here's an example just from a collection from NEHGS. We have thousands of pages of New Hampshire and other New England church records that were transcribed in the 19th and 20th century into our collections, and more of those are showing up on American Ancestors every year. And in this case, you have 18th century marriages from 1773 to 1789, recorded by Reverend William Conant of the First Parish, pastor of the First Congregational Church in Lyme, New Hampshire. So this isn't the original, but this would at least be a typescript that will start to help you. I always seek out the original. So when you see something like this, maybe a web page or a typescript or somebody's notes that don't look like they're recorded in 1773, seek out the original. You can use the things like Archive Grid. You can go and look online and see if there's an archive.org town history that may speak about the minister itself. You may contact a local historical society in Lyme, New Hampshire and say, listen, I'm trying to find where this original set of records from Reverend William Conant are. Are they with the Congregational Church? Contacting the Congregational Church and a small donation may get you a digital copy and an email to you in a short time. So that's a possibility. The other thing to keep in mind is, of course, Family Searches has now digitized so many collections in New England, including church records. And if they were able to get them, you may find that you look under the town itself and then look at church records, and you'll get a listing of the denominations that have been filmed. And hopefully they're not under affiliate access, and you can click on them and look at them at home. But don't give up if you don't find them on Family Search or at any HGS. One of the things that I always tell people is to really reach out to the small town historical societies. Find out who that local town historian is and find out and say, listen, I'm looking for church records. What survives from the 1700s, the 1800s, the early 1900s? What were the churches? And that's where those town histories come in to evolve, because a lot of people don't know what religion their ancestor may have been. Now, obviously, the first parish church in the 1600s is going to be really the only show in town. But by the time you get into the latter part of the 18th century and you've got the different religions that potentially your ancestor could be, then you're going to find so much more. So you want to be aware of different places to look and not just give up when you don't find it online. Now, one of the places that you can find them online, now, unfortunately, all they have currently at the Congregational Library and Archives in Boston for New Hampshire are the records for Dover, New Hampshire. And as I said originally, the first 4 communities in New Hampshire were Dover, Exeter, Hampton, and Portsmouth. Dover, this church was gathered back in 1633. Gives you a little bit of a collection history right here, and then we just take a peek at it. And you can see the variety of records. Now here it shows that their records go back to 1717, but there's also a letter in the church records that dates back to 1639. So you can find those original records. They're in color. They're very searchable. They're not name searchable, but they're browsable. So think of it as sort of like turning the page at an archive. The names aren't going to pop right off the top. Or scrolling through a roll of microfilm. Having these digital collections on there is going to make more and more of your research even easier. Now, town records, and this is one of the untapped resources. So many people will look for vital records, and right away we're thinking of birth, marriages, and deaths. The town records in New England would often, as we've learned, contain the vital records. Now, here's an example to the Index of New Hampshire Town Records, a family history library microfilm on microfilm at NEHGS. This is my 4th great-grandfather, Jacob Gale from Alexandria, New Hampshire. Now, if in the town records, he's on volume 1 and 2, it's a combined volume, and he's on all those pages. Well, that's great. But then I see MR and FR. That's where the vital record gold is. That is, the FR is the family record. That's the recording of the bride and the groom, their children, maybe the deaths that occur as well. And you may even get the marriage date of the bride and groom. Or you may have it singled out and find the actual marriage record for the bride and the groom recorded in the records, as in the case here for Jacob Gale is listing all of his kids. So they tell me here that Jacob Gale and Lydia Emerson were both married in 1803 by Reverend Thomas Page. And then it goes on to telling me that Jacob Gale, son of Eliphalet Gale, was born in January. It says 1799. It's actually 1779. Lydia Emerson, born in 1784. And then my third great-grandfather, Patty Gale, born in 1803. And it has some of the kids. So that's a family record that's put together, but it's also a marriage record, hence why it's on page 448. So the other records are still important to look at, because of course the names and dates we want, the vital records, are so important for filling in, but the town records give us all the history of the community, the original records of the selectmen. You may find that your ancestor was assigned a constable or a fence viewer, or maybe they even paid taxes or had other things. So if we look through town records, you can find other things besides the day-to-day operations of the community under the selectmen. On the next slide, we're going to have the proprietors' records. Remember when Massachusetts, we were talking about proprietor records, and I know you did for Maine as well. Those are the early settlement of land within the community. So the proprietor records are included in the town records for Newport, New Hampshire. And these example dates to 1764. Again, taxes. Finding the tax list, and that must have been the most arduous thing to copy over from the old records, line by line by line, of the pounds, shillings, and pence that they paid. And this is a case of rates for 1797 for the town, the school, the highway, and the county tax that each person is paying. And you might think, well, that's kind of boring. But you want to find the date your ancestor arrived in a community, they are paying a tax, or maybe they left the community and they still had real estate being held there. Taxes are really your key, because they are that thumbprint of when they were in the community and when they first arrived, and often when they left. You may also find that it might say widow Sarah Lambert, and knowing that's now that the widow Sarah Lambert, in the previous one, it had her husband Thomas Lambert listed. So you have to kind of look at the arrangement. Now in this case, the records are arranged, obviously not alphabetically. It's how the taxes were collected. Now, it could also be how, when the tax collector visited various house by house by house. With a good map, you may be able to map out where some of the houses were based on the route the tax collector went. Now, the other thing, obviously your ancestor came into town. Sometimes they're taken out of town. In this case, it's the warnings out. Warnings out are very detailed because they often will give reference to whence your ancestor came from. So say, for instance, you did not have legal settlement in a small town in New Hampshire early on. They went into the community. They were going to get settled. They're living with, say, their brother-in-law, and that didn't work out. They're still there. It wasn't like you could have family living there. The town fathers would look upon you and say, nope, they're not going to become a charge on us. Whatever happens to you, they can then become a town charge. So they are warned out. Or maybe they haven't legally settled their debts with a previous community and they're warned back for taxes. There's a variety of reasons, but for mostly it's because you're settling in a community and you don't have legal right to. So you are warned out of town, usually by the constable, by an act of the selectmen, as you see is the case here for Benjamin Kimball is the constable. He's requiring to warn Mary Keniston that she may belong to our town to go forth from this town to the town of Kingston, from whence she last came from. So now you have a genealogical clue. You know that she is in this town of Plaistow, and now she is going back to where she's from, in Kingston. The other thing, of course, as we've seen with the published vital records, knowing the annual town reports are really the children, if you will, of the old handwritten town records. You're going to still get the information about the selectmen. You're going to also get all the town records, and sometimes in abbreviated format. Now, here are births ending November 1931. I mean, these are these are under 90 years old, and they give you the name of the child, give you the name of the father and mother, the occupation, and birthplace of father and mother. And as you can see, even children that are illegitimate are recorded in these town records. Land records. One of the things that I find are really underutilized for New England research, a lot of people look at vital records in church. They occasionally will look at probate records if their ancestor had one, but land records. These are the things that are so hard to kind of follow because most people don't have the time to do that. And deeds are so important because they are giving us sometimes the occupation of our ancestor. When they're arriving into a community, you can sometimes track the division of a parcel of land. Maybe they received the land for love and affection from their father-in-law, and that's where the bride came from. You really need to understand and create a timeline of the deeds for your ancestors. So let's talk a little bit about what's available. So during the Smithsonian propriety period of 1629 to 1641, the New Hampshire provincial and state papers covers all of these earliest deeds from that time, from 1629 to 1641. That is in the New Hampshire State Papers in volume 29. You can go to that website link below, click on volume 29, have a PDF of the book right on your computer, and they are all indexed at the end. But I want you to know when you go to that link, at the very top hyperlink, before the volumes is actually an index to all of them. So if you've never thought of looking at the New Hampshire State Papers, nobody wants to sit and read cover to cover, you can go through surname by surname and be surprised at what records that are available. You'll also be able to find those town charters from the 17th and 18th century, which I think are important, especially with that question earlier, when was a town founded and established? You're going to find out that date. You're going to find out if land was annexed from another community. You may even find a clue about the idea of a proprietorship setup for the division of the land. Look at those original town charters. Those are again on the New Hampshire State Papers, volumes 27 to 28. And they're online, and it covers also the Massachusetts era of records from 1641 to 1679. Now, if they're in the New Hampshire State Papers, those records from the Massachusetts era are going to be in Concord, the original records themselves. But you're, again, harking back to one of those earlier questions, also look at the Massachusetts State Archives collection that's available at the Mass State Archives in Dorchester, Massachusetts. Their card index has plenty of things for New Hampshire, as well as a surname, and rather a full name index to the actual records itself. Now, what we have at NEHGS on microfilm are microfilm of family history library rolls. So more and more of these records are becoming available online from Family Search. And in the case of deeds, they are not affiliate access, so you can get to them. They have gotten permission to digitally put them online. As you can see, we have Belknap, Carroll, Cheshire, Coas, Grafton, and Hillsborough counties. And the one thing about the early deeds, everything prior to 1771 is under the old provincial deeds, and that's Rockingham County. So you can see a lot of these dates are a splitting. Now, some of them have an overlap. Like, for instance, if you look at Belknap, it has an index back to 1765. So somebody went through the old Rockingham County deeds and abstracted those ones that fell geographically in Belknap through 1771. And then they have the actual deeds recorded in Belknap in 1771. So there's a little bit of an overlap in some of them. There are also other counties, and that includes Merrimack, the old Norfolk deeds. We have those at NEHGS as well. Those cover 1647 to 1714. You're also getting the Rockingham, known as the provincial deeds, and they cover both the provincial deeds starting in 1643, and Rockingham is its own county currently as well, and we have those deed volumes right on through to 1864, keeping in mind that in 1771 all the other counties split from Rockingham, except of course Rockingham itself. Then of course we have Sullivan County, that's covering records 1827 to 1850. Now, again, Family Search has these records online. This is just a screenshot. If you go into looking at, for instance, Grafton, New Hampshire. So if I did a place name search, obviously it doesn't all fill in the little box here under United States, New Hampshire, Grafton. I'll get a drop down of the different categories. And under land and probate, I have the land record 1773 to 1902 in the index as well. And that is similar to what we have at NEHS. So once I click on that, I can drill further into the deeds itself. You can see there is no key conveniently placed for affiliate access over the camera. That means you can look at them at home. You're going to look at the grantor indexes first. That's going to give you your volume and page of those selling land, grantee of those buying the land, and that will have a grantor and grantee index that you can look at from home. And then you can actually get into the volumes and look at the actual deeds. The screen that you're going to see is obviously something like this. Now, some of you haven't used Family Search, so if you look at them, it looks like a lot of film strip, but you can zoom right in to any of the actual pages itself. You have to kind of get a sense of where you are first. So I always click on the volume, make sure I'm in the volume that I need, and then I start looking at the pages. And say if I need page 37, keeping in mind there's generally 2 pages per image. Kind of do the math, so I might want to go count over 18 images, click on it, and then pop up the deed that I want to see. And this is true rule of thumb for any of the actual images. And so here we have a deed that's available, and you can play with the contrast and brightness. You can also download these images right from Family Search, making the contrast and brightness on your own computer before you print it out, or maybe you just care to save it digitally. Remember, these aren't searchable. You can't put in, say, Daniel Smith and Daniel Kimball, but you can manually look through grantor and grantee indexes and find out the right volume and page. That's the labor-intensive part that a lot of people don't look at. But folks, the deeds are going to be a clue for you. If a person dies and their estate is being settled and they don't have a probate, sometimes it is their heirs that are dividing off the property. I have plenty of family up in New Hampshire that didn't have last will and testaments, but they had a deed where they divided amongst the heirs. Or you might find that a deed is a conveyance between a father and mother to their child at no cost of, say, maybe more than $1 or £1 for love and affection. So you can maybe find that connection for a generation you're trying to use to prove your DAR or your SAR application. Now, again, just that reminder tip that all provincial deeds before 1771 are registered in Rockingham County, New Hampshire. Now, the provincial deed and probate index is its own collection on microfilm. And it's a very funny thing about these records itself, that the microfilm that we have at NEHS is of the index. So we have, for instance, this deed of Beatrice Abernathy to Samuel Rankins in 1765. They're not 100% sure, so it may just say 1766. It's land in Londonderry. It gives me my volume and page. So then I can look at those early provincial deeds and go forward and look at the actual original record. Now, the index for probate, the records are on film, but the record index is on film, but the records that we have are on microfiche. So you might be looking at 2 different machines at the same time to do your work. So let's go on to the next image here. And here's one of the early recorded deeds. This is from 1765, and there's that Abernathy to Rankin deed. Very flowery handwriting, but fairly well and easy to read. One thing I can tell you, if you ever want to spend your free time doing good for your genealogical records, is to transcribe those deeds, because more and more people have a problem with handwriting, it seems. So transcribing them out might be a volunteer project you're interested in. And who knows, maybe you have enough land in a community that you might volunteer others in a social media group to transcribe, say, all the deeds for Alexandria, New Hampshire, or something like that. Pick a project. Might have a little free time right now. Now, remember to cite the entire range of pages for the deed it covers in your citation of the deed. Now, and this may seem a little bit silly, but I like to give people the idea of when they're looking something up, if they needed volume 87, page 121. I've had some people with document delivery, not where I work, but other places where I say, yes, the deed is volume 87, page 121. They give me volume 87, 121, and don't give me the next few pages of the deed. I did ask for that one page, but remember to put a hyphen in the full page range once you find it. The grantor grantee index is going to be just that starting point. And sometimes the deed can be at the very bottom of that image because there could be a deed before it. And even some small ones, sometimes I've seen multiple deeds on the same page if it's just a mortgage, etc.
All right, thanks again, David. Let's pause here, see if you have any questions. Go ahead and type them into the chat panel. So Robert asks, so again, where is that index to New Hampshire town records found? I think, again, that beautiful microfilm for your ancestor that you showed with the FR and the MR, where can you find that?
Sure. The New Hampshire Town Records Collection Index is part of Family Search, as are all the microfilm that we have for New Hampshire. They were filmed by the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, and that collection, again, is going to be on Family Search. And I'm more than happy to, again, take a peek at the catalog and see if we can find out if they're locked or unlocked for you, because I can do it from home here. And I'll take another question.
Great. Thanks, David, for multitasking. So talented.
My pleasure. Hey, I try.
And Barbara asks, so how was legal right to settle in a town established? And I think this is referring to your discussion of warnings out. How would you get that legal right to settle in a town?
This is something, obviously, it's dependent. First off, if you own land, you purchase land in the town, you're now paying taxes. One of the reasons that people get warned out of town oftentimes is when one of the two people die, they become elderly, there's no surviving children nearby to take care of them, that they will actually warn somebody out of town that may have lived in town for 60 years back to once they came. Or if not, what happens, they become a charge on the town. Financial, so there either has to be nursing care or wood being brought to them or food, etc. Long before a poorhouse or a pauper's home was created in the community, they would have sort of at-home care, if you will. People would be guardians, if you will, in some cases, to a person in town who couldn't care for themselves. So oftentimes, if you weren't warned out, physically removed, especially with the elderly, you would end up getting your hometown charged back for the cost of your care. And you find selectmen writing to other selectmen of a neighboring town that we have Sarah Johnson here. She's a native of Newmarket, New Hampshire. We are the selectmen in Bristol. You need to care for her. We're sending her back to your town to care for it. And in some cases, it might be cheaper for them to send some sort of an allowance, if you will. But yeah, legal residents of owning land, paying taxes, and having that availability still, where later on in life someone may not, especially if they're a widow and they're not selling off the property and belongings. To go back to that question for our friend there, the index to early New Hampshire town records was filmed in 1950. It's 111 rolls of 16 millimeter microfilm, and it is available to look at on Family Search. If you put in Family History Library microfilm 14942, you will find again the first instance of the film. So if you do a Family History Library catalog search on film number 14942, that will bring you to the first instance of the surname Ada, C-O-T-T. And then you can look at all of them, click on them. That will give you the actual records, and then the volumes for the town records are also available from Family Search.
And that was 14942, is that right?
14942, correct.
Okay,
Very early filmed. It was filmed 70 years ago.
Great. Let's see, another question. Barbara asks, where might one find Baptist church records, or how would you start to see what's available for that, for Baptists?
Sure. Well, I mean, my philosophy has always been charity starts at home, and maybe there's still a First Baptist church or a Second Baptist church in a particular community. So finding out if there is still a Baptist parsonage or parish rather in the community first off. Um, the next step would be to contact that town to see if in fact there is a town historian. And what I generally do is I will call the public library up and say, who's your local genealogist that handles your questions, or who's in charge of the historical society? I get on the phone with them or send them an email, and I say, I know that there were Baptists in, say, Kingston, New Hampshire. Where are the records? Now, if they don't know, they may refer you to a nearby town. And sometimes if a church has closed its doors, if you will, they may have merged with a nearby community, and they may have taken on the flock and the records for that family. Keeping one thing in mind with Baptist church records, Baptist ministers and Methodist ministers who travel the circuit, for instance, would often record the records and keep them themselves. They didn't have to keep them with the actual church, especially early on. So you may need to find out who the minister was who was traveling the circuit if there was no established church, and then looking for that person's family papers. You also want to try places like the New Hampshire Historical Society and, of course, local public libraries and historical societies if the church doesn't exist. And again, going back to Family Search, looking at Family Search's Family History Library catalog under the town and see if there are any records available.
All right, and Rebecca asks, are there any resources specific to that or that mention loyalists, both military and civilian, that removed and or returned to New Hampshire?
Okay, so if you're a loyalist and you're leaving and going north to, say, Canada during the Revolutionary War, the town may have seized your property, so you may look in the grantor and grantee index of that particular county's records. Of course, in 1771, you have Rockingham splitting and all the counties are daughtering off from it. So you're going to have to look at, of course, that particular county. The other thing is the New Hampshire state papers may catch something in there. If you look through and there may be an arrest warrant. Maybe your ancestor didn't flee and they got caught for suspicion. A lot of the loyalist activity from what I've seen historically were the merchant class that lived in Portsmouth and Exeter and places like that, but not so much as I see down in, say, Massachusetts. But again, there were loyalists throughout New England, and you should find records of them. I can't think of a specific book that lists all loyalists of New Hampshire, I'm afraid, but if you want to drop me a note, I'm more than happy to look a little further into it for you.
Great, thank you. And Kathy asks, how are Manchester and other city records different from, say, some of the town records that you talked about? The availability of those, the types of records that you might find. How is kind of Manchester and other cities different?
Yeah, the problem with the larger cities is, one, it's a large population. Less records are often kept. So occasionally you're going to find like not a lot of births recorded, especially once you get into the 19th century. Marriages are going to generally be caught, and death records are generally going to be caught. But again, keeping in mind that it wasn't until the early part of the 20th century that it all get standardized. The early records, I believe, from Manchester, initially were not sent into the state, and there were some difficulty getting them. But now that was a story I heard 30 years ago. And in recent years, of course, with more access to records and things becoming digitized, it is entirely possible that you'll probably have greater access to the records of some of these larger cities that were not included before. When I was dealing with Massachusetts, I talked about Boston. One of the worst culprits was the city of Boston recording statewide vital records. Births were started to be recorded in 1841. They didn't get around to it until 1850 for the city of Boston. And this is true with New Hampshire cities as well, just a little limited on their returns.
And Douglas asks, is there a resource that would help explain early colonial deeds? How to find out where the properties were in town? Anything that comes to mind as far as a resource to help understand? the location of those places.
Oh, sure. I mean, if you're really lucky, Doug, the historical societies may have a map, especially if they're proprietor lots that are drawn up, that actually may show you a geographical location on a proprietor's plot plan, if you will. And then sometimes in the maps, I'm sorry, in the deeds, you'll find plot maps that are included that actually will show you the abutting property. 50 rods from that white tree to that pile of rocks. I mean, obviously things that are not going to help you when you're standing in the parking lot of Walmart trying to triangulate where your ancestors' property is now, if it's been built upon. But historical societies are great for maps. Keeping this in mind, it may be looking at a very early family in the, say, the 1750s. Well, if the family continued to own that property and there's still a living person from that family on there, by the middle of the 19th century, a lot of county maps actually had dots on a map with the family of who owned that farm. So you may be able to apply a 19th century location for a farm and just peel back the deeds, sort of like a title search, if you will, to see if that same family owned the property in the 1700s. You overlay something like that with a Google Earth map, you might find the farm's house is still standing. But the easiest way, contact the local historical society by email, find if they have something in the public library. A lot of these early properties are included in town histories as well. They take photographs of them. They include, here's the old homesteads. So it shouldn't be too difficult. Depends on the town and how well they've been documented.
All right. And Sarah, just going back to the index for New Hampshire town records, Sarah mentions that some of the films later in the series are actually locked, whereas the ones in the earlier part of the series are unlocked. Any idea why?
Oh, gosh.
Or
okay.
what to do about
Yeah,
that?
there it is. Yeah, I see that. Wow. I don't generally see only part. They go from A to page, they're unlocked, and then page to right, or the end of the alphabet, Z, they are locked. What's happening is that they're basically taking the films and digitizing them and getting the permissions. Now, why that one's like that, I'll tell you, you found a unique one. I've never seen it where it's only done half of the alphabet, or a little bit more than half the alphabet. I would say that that's a good question for Family Search as to why they kind of stopped cold with that, because the sequence of the numbers are correct. It goes from like 15016 to 15017. It's just an alphabetical break. So I'm not entirely sure on that one. I think it's worth an email to Family Search. Why don't you contact me? We'll do that one together.
All right. And I know that there are a few questions about newspapers. I know we'll touch upon that a little bit in the next section, so I'll save those questions. But for right now, I'll turn it back over to you, David, and carry on.
Okay. So obviously, if our ancestors had any property, maybe personal or land, there's a good chance they probably had a probate record. Or if they owned had any debt owed to their estate, you may find a probate. Or if they had anything that they owed out from their estate, maybe the estate is being sold and divided up. Now, the New Hampshire probate records to 1771, they go back to the 1600s, are abstracted in New Hampshire State Papers, volumes 31 to 39, including the wills completely transcribed out. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. The NEHCS microfilm that we have are for the following counties that run from Belknap all the way down to Sullivan. And again, I had mentioned the early provincial probate files. Ironically, they're not on film that we have. We have them on microfiche, and the quality is really good. I have an example of one of those to show you. And just keep in mind that Family Search and Ancestry.com, all the counties for varied years from 17th to 20th century are available, unless it's a surprise like we just found for New Hampshire town records, where only half of it is actually unlocked. You've got Murphy's Law of Genealogy right there. All right, so the New Hampshire State Papers, I wanted to show you what the website looks like. And as you can see here at the bottom, there's volume 1 and volume 21. Once you click on that, that actually is going to bring up a PDF file that you can download. So really, you could download the whole series and have it on a thumb drive if you want. It's a lot more space conscious than having all the volumes stacked up on your bookshelf. But the real important one is to get that first one, the Index to New Hampshire State Papers, which is a modern typed out index. Here's an example from that early probate. This is from volume 31 of the series, and that is volume 1 of the probate. And here's the will of Godfrey Dearborn in 1680 from Hampton, New Hampshire. And as you can see, it is transcribed out, and you get all of the superscript as well as all of the detail right there. Now, I don't stop there. I want to go track down the original, and I want to look at the original as well as the transcript. But this does save you from having to retranscribe out an early probate for New Hampshire. Again, New Hampshire State Papers. Now, the Provincial Probate Index. Remember I told you the index is on film and the records are on fiche. Here is William Pittman, one of my early ancestors who died in February 28, 1699/1700. Now, he died intestate, and he has an inventory, and there are also a variety of other papers available for him. So this is just a reference to his inventory. It tells me that it's on volume 4, page 123, but the original file is the docket 225. So I get both the record book copy as well as the file. So when I go to the microfiche, I'm delighted to find out that there should be a file copy and a record book. So in case there's something missing, this tip is so important. You want to look at the record book because some of the papers are copied over there for the original file. So if something gets lost from the original file, you get that checks and balances. That being said, there are some papers in a probate file, for instance, the loose receipts, that may have not been copied into the record book. So folks, you got to look at both. So let's take a peek at the original record. And this is from the microfiche, and this is 225. Now, if I had just stopped at that index, it just told me the volume and page for that inventory. If I had scrolled back a couple, it would have told me that there's also a volume and page for his last will and testament. So he didn't die intestate. He actually had a will. And here's his will that was proven in 1699/1700. Very easy to read. And again, it's from microfiche. That image itself is probably smaller than a regular postage stamp. Blows up pretty well, I think. Now, the record book is just that. It's a copy. So here's a copy, not of the original will by Thomas Wheelock in 1831, but the one that was copied into the ledger books. This checks and balances system is really good, especially when file papers are lost or a record book may have been destroyed by fire. There is that possibility of the original being available and vice versa. Again, the one thing that's interesting about the file papers when you look at them, if I was to leave a will right now, I have 2 unmarried daughters. Now, if I was to die 10, 15, 20 years from now, they're married, that in my will, if I didn't do a codicil and change it, it's going to mention my daughters by their maiden names. Now, fast forward, I've passed away. In the file papers, my daughters are having to legally say, I received the portion from my father's estate and signed their married names, if perhaps they're married. So you're going to get that clue. Those type of receipts aren't copied into the record book. But what's nice about the record book copy, it's sometimes a standardized handwriting that's a lot easier to read than the actual file paper. Use both, less headaches that way. All right, town histories. At NEHGS, we have so many New Hampshire town histories, from some that are as thin as probably a few business cards put together that are just little compilations from newspapers, histories that have been put together, to tomes that are 800, 900, 1,000 pages long. Depending how well documented and how well versed in the local history, you will find things from military history to genealogical chapters on families. And you may not find a published genealogy in a family, but if you look at the town history, there's often a genealogy chapter. So think of town history as not as just sort of boring, dry histories. They're going to give you your genealogical clues, they're going to give you military records, and they also are going to teach you what's going on. Remember, we're looking at church records. We need to know who the churches are, who the ministers are in town. This is where that reveal is going to come to you. And so many of these town histories, folks, were done in the 19th and early 20th century that you can do archive.org, search on town history, Bristol, New Hampshire. Boom, there's your link. You can download the PDF and have it on your computer, and you can search on it on archive.org or HathiTrust, for instance. So build your own virtual library at home. Now, one of the things that you can find in not as many for New Hampshire than, say, Connecticut or Massachusetts is you're going to find city directories. In New Hampshire, city directories go back into the early part of the 19th century. And here's just a drop-down list from Ancestry.com of some of the towns, not complete because we have to go further down, of the communities that are available. The years are going to vary too. Keep in mind with city directories that sometimes more than one town is combined, and sometimes you're not looking for a city directory, but a county directory that encompasses a directory of many communities within that county. Archive.org. Here is just, I put in a search for Rochester, New Hampshire, and I found out that Dover, Great Falls, and Rochester have a directory in 1871-72. Besides what you're going to find in directories, which we've already talked a little bit about, I love the ads, especially if your ancestor was in business for themselves. You may find an ad. Maybe if they were a teamster, you might find a picture of a horse and a wagon. If they were a dairyman, you might have a picture of their prize cow on there. So it's really a surprise, and they're going to vary from year to year. They're not always every year, though. So you might find you have something from 71 to 75, and then you got to jump forward to 1883 to find the next one. But really look for these folks, especially if you're 19th and early 20th century New Hampshire families. Military records. I love military records. There are a variety of things that we talked about in Massachusetts. So if you kind of go back to that, you'll find that there are so many things applicable. The Civil War records, for instance, are searchable on the National Parks website, the Civil War Soldier System. You'll find that. The New Hampshire State Papers, we've already learned, includes the muster rolls from the Revolutionary War. We have a catalog on American ancestors. If you just put in a particular war and New Hampshire, you'll find the brings that we have. If you go to familysearch.org, you'll also find things under the military records of the state. You just have to drill down, and also military history. The New Hampshire State Archives has records from the provincial conflicts all the way to the Civil War, and you can search for them at the archives there, but be surprised. Some things you can find online right from Family Search. The one that I really love, and it's a little more earlier than just the Revolutionary War. So titles can be deceiving. This one exactly is a little deceiving. The New Hampshire Revolutionary War records. I want you to look down under the word reference here under, it'll say format, language, publication, reference. New Hampshire Revolutionary War records, 1675 to 1835. So you're going, after the Revolutionary War by over 50 years and 100 years before the Revolutionary War. Yeah, this has got colonial war records in here as well as War of 1812 and militia right on to the 1830s. A great collection, and it is available digitally to look at on Family Search. We're going to talk a bit about some of the repositories that you can go to and the type of things that you're going to find there. The one that, of course, you really should get to after COVID is passed is the New Hampshire State Archives. This beautiful building, both with a combination of a modern and a Greek revival look to it, looks like you're walking into your ancestors' town hall, is a great place to find both vital records, probate records, and land records. You'll find all those petitions to the governor and the governor's council. So if your ancestor was seeking a divorce, for instance, in colonial period, or they had a thing in the courts, the governor was now going to be the final say. These petitions go from 1680 right to 1850, and they other records that go right up through to 1951. They, of course, have the original copy of the set of the papers from the New Hampshire State Provincial Papers we've been talking about. So all those original records are there. There are published military lists. There are the federal censuses. They have name changes. There are photographs, naturalization records, voter checklists, prisoner records, and all sorts of wonderful things right under the roof of these buildings. Now, one of the places that we go to at NEHGS is the New Hampshire Historical Society. Myself and my colleagues have lectured there numerous times over the years, and they are really a tremendous library and have collections of rare books and histories of New Hampshire, bar none, and are wonderful to visit. Again, this is the New Hampshire Historical Society, and what you're going to find there are collections that deal with both town histories, county histories. You're going to find diaries and journals. One of the things that you really need to keep in mind is you really need to go on the local level. Now, the state library and historical societies are these places that you want to check out because people deposit their papers there. So if you don't find it in the local library, try the state library. Local historical, try the New Hampshire State Historical Society. A particular diary of Reverend Enos George of Barnstead, New Hampshire, who baptized my ancestor when he was 100 years old in 1832. I've been looking for his journal for years. 5 years ago, somebody donated it to the New Hampshire Historical Society. I can be guaranteeing that the next trip I go up there, I'll be spending some time looking at that. And they do allow you to use a digital camera or your iPhone to make scans. I think you have to fill out a form, but it is well worth it. Do look at their website, newhampshirehistory.org, for further information on their catalog collections. Another wonderful place, and at a new location since June of 2020, is the American Canadian Genealogical Society. Now, this is a wonderful place to visit, and they have collections that, of course, are geared to both Acadian and French Canadian resources. They're located right there in Manchester, New Hampshire, their little library, and they have the repertoires of French Canada. They have over 10,000 records, including the church repertoires, and for records that even go as far as the Hudson Valley. They have copies of PRDH, the collections of early marriages. They have records of local churches in New Hampshire that were Catholic, French Canadian churches, and Acadian records. I would definitely suggest, especially if you have French Canadian ancestors from New Hampshire, to look into the American Canadian Genealogical Society and in their collections. But you can go to the larger facilities, but sometimes gold is found on the smaller ones. So your local county historical societies or whole small town historical societies need your love too. And they're going to give you collections that may only be there. How about the person who kept all the school records that were found in the dumpster back in the 1960s that date back to the 1870s? How about the person that has all the school yearbooks, all the photos, the diaries of family members that were rescued before they tore the house down? Collections that have been gathered up for sometimes over 100, 125 years or more in small historical societies, sometimes located in former homes, sometimes they're located in former schoolhouses, fire buildings, etc., fire department buildings. You're going to find these a treasure trove. And unfortunately, not all of them have websites. They may not even have regular hours, but you should be able to get a hold of a contact by contacting the local public library in the town in New Hampshire. Say, how do I find the Historical Society? If you do that, I'm sure you'll be well rewarded. Their memberships are probably $10 or $15 for the year. You get their newsletter, you help support them, and then probably for a small donation, if you can't get there yourself, they'll even do some genealogical research for you. Well worth the money. You know, there are so many databases out there to cover. I mean, you can look at a website like Cindy's List or look at Family Search, but I want to just talk a little bit about online catalogs itself. Now, on American Ancestors, as you know, we have so many records, over 28 million manuscripts, over a quarter of a million books, and this has got a lot of coverage for New England, especially New Hampshire. Now, you can do a keyword search, and that's going to search all of the data fields for matching words. So if you wanted to put in our catalog and search, say, New Hampshire Revolutionary War, you could do that. Now you can also do a title or an author search. So Walter Goodwin Davis, who wrote the Genealogical Dictionary, co-author of the Genealogical Dictionary of Maine and New Hampshire, you can search on the title, you can search on him, or if you click on the name of the author, you can find out all the books that particular author has published. And you may find more titles than you actually had bargained for. You can do a subject search, and that will go for matching words. It may be all of the books that we have on the Revolutionary War or on the Civil War. Again, you can also do that with keyword searching. Archival materials are described in our finding aids. So our team at NEHGS has put together some really wonderful finding aids that explain different collections. That way you're not just presented with 5 boxes of manuscripts. You'll know what's in the boxes before you're having to go through it. We've already processed them for you. And we have been collecting New Hampshire records since our inaugural year of 1845, 175 years ago. You can also look for New Hampshire records that we've already gone the next step. We've digitized them or we've indexed them with our fleet of volunteers. So if you go to our database list on americanancestors.org/browse-database, you can put in New Hampshire and you'll find the 466 related databases we have for the state of New Hampshire. Now, once you're in a collection, say for instance, the New Hampshire birth, marriages, and deaths that I talked on early on from 1654 to 1969, you can search on a first name and a last name. You can put in a range of years. Say if you wanted every Lambert that was born between 1790 and 1897, you could do that. You could select the type of record, birth, marriage, or death. You can even browse the volume and page if you already have a citation. Now, of course, Ancestry.com also have records. The one thing you need to know about Ancestry, it's on their collection page. Once you log in, you go to search, and then you do the drop down to card catalog. From there, you want to put in New Hampshire as the title match that you're going to have. And in this case, you have about 150 matches of databases in contrast to our over 400 that we have on American Ancestors. You can do a search on their collection of birth, marriages, and deaths, 1659 to 1900. You can actually browse geographically the record set itself, or you can put in a first name or last name and scroll and do your search that way. You can also add details such as the mother or father's first and last name. Of course, we've talked about family search throughout the past 3 classes, and I'm sure you'll hear more in the next as well. But family search is so very valuable. Using their family search catalog, remember, if you're dealing with something that's on the state level, like military records, just type in New Hampshire, the collection drill down to military records. If you're dealing with land and probate, put in the state name and the county name. And if you're dealing with looking for church records or vital records or town records, then you want to search right down to the town level itself. Now, remember, we were talking about deeds, and so many of them are actually online. There's a variety of the formats we need to be aware of, and as we can see down here in this little circle, that you have a question mark, that means it's searchable. That means you can search on the words within a record. If it's got a bobbin of film, as the one on the right-hand side here, that means it's only on microfilm. The best one that you want is one that has a magnifying glass and a camera, or at least a camera that you can browse. And the one you need to worry about for affiliate access are the ones with the key and the camera right there at the bottom. So there is a really nice website that will help you geographically understand some of the county boundaries, and that is this website here, publications.newbury.org, AHCBP. You can pick a particular county and pick the time frame, and it'll give you the border changes of that county and where it opens up, and you can zoom in and see some detail that will help you, especially if you're doing deed research. Another thing that I love are, of course, newspapers. Now, I could be an hour just talking about newspapers for New England, which is probably something I'll end up doing in the near future. But remember, Genealogy Bank is one that you can get from home. That is going to have a lot of the early Redex newspapers that are available. Early American newspaper series, New Hampshire papers you're going to find for some of the early settlements back until the latter part of the 18th century, sometimes a little earlier. But what's available from the New Hampshire State Library is this great list here. Now, this list is going to give you all of the microfilm that they have in their collection and the date range, the city published, and the title of the newspaper. And again, this is a catalog of the newspapers at the New Hampshire State Library. Maybe someplace that you will want to visit. You may find that these aren't online on newspapers.com or on Genealogy Bank, so don't limit to just what's online. Of course, another one that you can use online is chroniclingamerica.loc.gov. From the Library of Congress, there are countless newspapers since the first one published in Boston in 1690, all the way down through into the 20th century, into the 21st century. A variety of newspapers you can select on the state, the county, and the city. I would start looking at states first, then drill into the county and seeing what towns within the county are available. And then lastly, if you have a lot, like say a city of Manchester or Concord, seeing the particular papers that are available. Again, doing this for free from the Library of Congress at home. So much genealogy can be done while you're sitting at home during COVID, but we have so much more to offer for you when you can come back. Now, one thing that you do want to look at as well, and maybe contribute while you're home, are cemeteries. Findagrave.com is probably one of my most favorite websites for cemetery research. I also like Billion Graves. I'm partial to Find a Grave because it has so many more entries already in there, but what it seems to have is a lot of participation from New Hampshire. I had talked about my Pittman ancestor that was baptized when he was 100 years old. Supposedly the story is he went and fought at Bunker Hill with a pitchfork. Still haven't found him in the New Hampshire State Papers, but it's still a good oral tradition in the family. John Pittman's gravestone, he lived to be 101. This cemetery has probably fewer than 100 gravestones in Barnstead, New Hampshire, and they're all photographed. You can search in the arrangement. It even has a spouse, it has his children, and this is just one way of doing remote genealogy when you can't get out from home. I do welcome you to American Ancestors to look at our databases. Do explore the other websites that I've talked about, and do look for digital books. Go to libraries and archives, and I hope sometime to see you in Boston. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. So let's take any final questions that you might have. Go ahead and type it into the chat panel. So Luann asks, do you need any special card to search in New Hampshire State Archives as you do in, say, Connecticut?
No. New Hampshire State Archives is going to have the historical records itself, and they do not have any. I mean, I'm sure you're going to have to show an ID. So you're going to go in and probably register. Obviously, they're going to probably have you lock away any of your belongings, etc. But you're going to find, Luann, that a lot of the things, the early records at least, you're going to be able to find online from Family Search, American Ancestors, Ancestry.com. So try to rule those things out and only look for the records at the archives that you can only get at the archives. It'll definitely speed up your time when you're there and get more productivity going.
And I know, as I mentioned, there were a few questions about newspapers for New Hampshire. I think you gave us a few spots to look at. Debbie does say, why are no New Hampshire newspapers digitized, or am I missing something? So where would you suggest she start looking for those papers?
Oh, sure. Well, Debbie, one of the subscriptions, and again, this is not an endorsement by any HGS, but just as a suggestion from one genealogist to another, is Genealogy Bank. So for Genealogy Bank, you can drill in and see what newspapers are actually available. Keeping in mind that small town newspapers may have never been microfilmed. They could still be in the particular public libraries and the newspaper morgue books, if you will, those large bound editions of the newspapers, which is what I've seen in some of the towns in New Hampshire. They've never had the money to microfilm them, let alone have them digitized that one step further. That's why it's important to look at that catalog that I supplied for the New Hampshire State Library. That is one of the places that has one of the most complete collections of New Hampshire papers. Whether or not you find it on newspapers.com, Genealogy Bank, that's where the repository would be. Looking at Genealogy Bank or newspapers.com, those are going to be places that if they had access, most of the time you're going to find those in more urban newspapers, if you will, that have a larger run. But there are going to be those small newspapers that pop up for just 4 or 5 years or a couple of years that may be that one pinnacle year you're looking for. So don't ignore the Genealogy Bank and newspapers.com, for instance, as an example, or those are going to be useful, but that shouldn't be the last place you search when you're not finding them online. Look for them places like the New Hampshire State Historical Society, the New Hampshire State Library, and again, local public libraries. I contact the public library and I ask them what newspaper was being published in your town in the 1920s if I'm going to look for an obituary. And they may say that we didn't have a newspaper. It was 2 towns away. So that local newspaper a couple of towns away is going to want to sell newspapers in my ancestors' small town, and they're going to cover the news, the obituaries, etc. From the things that the Miller family is on vacation in Vermont to the death of the 30-year-old cow that the Miller family had, to unfortunately the death of the 97-year-old father of the Miller family. So you're going to get all the news stories. Those newspapers back in the 19th and 20th century really give you more news than you would imagine that anyone would even think of printing now.
And Carolyn notes that you might want to warn researchers that there's a lot of information on Find a Grave that's not strictly from the grave and it may not be right. Do you want to provide any warnings?
Oh, sure. Yeah, let the Find a Graver beware. The problem with Find a Grave, if you're not looking at the actual gravestone that somebody is, people can create an entry for anybody, regardless if they're even buried there. Case in point, my hometown in Massachusetts, I have scoured a cemetery that's locked. I have a key to it because I'm the town's historian, and I know every gravestone that's there. I even have transcriptions of the stones that were done in the 1890s, so I know what was there 100 years ago. Some of them have fallen, have disappeared, etc. But people will assume that someone's buried there, hence putting a location. I've even found people that didn't even exist, colonial people that they've assumed that's who the parents were, must be buried somewhere in New England. And also, if you ever get really creative, go to Find a Grave and put in Fido Smith. Yes, folks, pets are in Find a Grave as well.
All right. Well, thank you, David, again for your fantastic presentation. Of course, if we didn't get to your question or if something comes up as you start applying some of what you've learned to your own family history research, questions come up, you can reach out to our instructors directly. You'll find their email address on the course webpage. And again, that very long URL to the course webpage is there on the screen. I've included it in my emails to you. I'll send another follow-up email once this recording is posted. But this is really your home base for the next couple of weeks. That's where you find the handouts, the slides, the recordings, some other resources that we may post along the way. And of course, as I mentioned, the emails for each of our instructors. You'll have access to all of that content until the end of November of this year. So thank you again for joining us. Be sure to join us next week at the same time when genealogist Ann Lothers will guide us through the Green Mountain State of Vermont. And if you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I look forward to seeing you online next week. Goodbye for now.